Hello and welcome to this special broadcast from Bengaluru, where the first major meeting under India's G20 presidency is taking place. During this finance track meeting, finance ministers and central bank governors from G20 nations are brainstorming on issues plaguing the global economy. Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman has held 10 bilateral meetings, including one with US Secretary for Treasury Janet Yellen. Yellen hit out at Russia in a press conference and said building support for Ukraine will be her #1 priority during the G20 meetings. She also urged China to agree to proposals on debt restructuring to help countries like Zambia and Sri Lanka. Listen in to what Janet Yellen had to say.
I will continue to push for all bilateral official creditors, including China, to participate in meaningful debt treatments for developing countries and emerging markets in distress. I will also be discussing international coordination on debt restructuring for middle-income countries. In emerging markets, financial conditions remain relatively tight, but have begun to show signs of easing. At the same time, we know that a number of vulnerable countries continue to face acute distress. We're not out of the woods yet. So I'm looking forward to the opportunity this week to continue our close communication with other major economies. We've worked with countries to avoid export restrictions and enable food to flow more freely, including through the Black Sea Grain Initiative.
The outgoing president of the World Bank, David Malpass, has said that the world needs to find an answer to inflation concerns. He also hoped that the G20 will come to an agreement on debt resolution for emerging economies. Listen in to what he told our managing editor, Shireen Bhan.
Reconciling the debts of the various players, that's been taking a long time within the debt restructuring process. So reconcile the debts, agree that what you're trying to do is have comparable treatment across the various creditors, and then find ways to resolve some of the barriers. On China, important is they are still including non-disclosure clauses in some of their contracts. That makes it very difficult to do the restructuring. They take collateral, which is not really necessary, and also escrow accounts. China itself can benefit from this. It's one of the biggest exporters, often the biggest to many parts of the world, and so it can benefit if there's faster growth in the countries.
On the sidelines of this G20 meeting, I caught up with Brazil's ambassador to India, Andre Arana Correa de Lago, and I asked him about Brazil's priorities, also how the Ukraine war will impact discussions at the G20 meeting in Bengaluru and the issue of climate finance. Listen in.
Well, as you know, after India's presidency, it's going to be Brazil's presidency. So we are watching with enormous interest and very closely and talking to our Indian counterparts to make sure that we do everything possible for this presidency to be a success. India and Brazil have very, very similar views of what can be achieved in this meeting. So I believe that what is extremely important in that sequence of developing countries chairing G20 is to show that many of the solutions that the world is looking for can come from countries like India, like Brazil, like South Africa and Indonesia. So I think this is the great exercise, is to show how much we are engaged in dealing with the issues that go beyond our countries, that go beyond our regions.
Right. Ambassador, we also believe that there will be a lot of discussion on Ukraine, even though G20 is not a security forum, but the impact of the war, the human suffering, the economic cost will play on the minds of all leaders. How do you think the topic of Ukraine will be approached, and what kind of consensus would we want on minimizing the impact of the war and probably bringing the war to an end?
There again, India and Brazil have a very similar view. We would like this war to end. As Prime Minister Modi says, this is not the time for war. So we believe that obviously the economic dimension of the wars, of any war, is terrible. And so We have to know, to understand this impact, and make sure that this impact can be overcome. There is an issue, for instance, for Brazil or for India that is extremely important, is the issue of fertilizers. So this is an issue that has an impact on food all over the world. So the economic impact of this war cannot be avoided in the discussions, but always in the sense of being constructive and contributing to, as soon as possible, a solution, a peaceful solution.
Right. Now, we are looking at floods, we're looking at heat wave conditions. When it comes to climate action, do you hope that there will be some concrete development on the issue of climate finance at this G20 meeting?
Well, you know that climate finance has already been extremely debated and agreed under the Convention on Climate Change. So there is a line that has already been approved. Now what we need is really to implement what we know are the necessities of the world. So naturally, everywhere the ministers of finance are key for being able to make sure the resources that will fight climate change will be available. So it is natural that in a discussion like that, this issue can be raised and we hope advance significantly.
On that note, we take a short break, but don't go anywhere. As the Ukraine-Russia war completes 1 year, we'll get you a ground report from Ukraine.